Greetings and welcome to another C# live coding session. We are working on a Minecraft server launcher application. And last time we ran into a couple of problems with the current setup, one of them being the console parser that had a minor issue with a missing slash. And we also have a teeny tiny problem with cross-synchronizing the server profiles with whichever server is running. So today we are going to attack these problems and see if we can come up with a good solution for them. So let's have a quick look. Now, as I mentioned, one of the issues we have is the console parser, which is part of the server host class. So to try and get that solved, we'll dig into that and see if we can find all the stuff that we need to mess with. Alright, so one of the major differences between running a vanilla and a Forge server is that Forge also exposes which mod effectively dumped the console message. So for a Forge setup, actually let's just grab a copy of this one just because we can. There we go. For a Forge setup, that means it adds in a third bracket which contains the identification of the mod itself. And that's the reason the current parser code ran into the problem of crashing whenever it attempted to fetch the thread and log level, because the code assumes that there are only two of these brackets, which means when running a modded server and the mod ID shows up, of course it won't have the slash where it expects it to be. So today we're going to add in some extra support for Forge-based servers, which means we actually need to extend our string manipulation a bit. Before we do that, though, I think we should add in an extra entry in our entry setup so that we can store the identification of the mod if it exists. So we'll put that in here. Mod ID equals mod ID trim. There we go. This now also supports a possible mod ID if it is a modded server. So in order to get that, we kind of need to figure out how many of these brackets we actually have in the past log entry that comes from the server. So in terms of splitting stuff and correctly adding it, we may want to consider doing a split instead. And then simply checking how many occurrences of or how many entries we get out of it. So let's see if we can get part of that done. For now, we will see about, let's see, grab a copy of the log message from the console line starting just past. Yes, this part we need. However, this part we don't need. So we will comment this and then redo all of this stuff. So for now, let's just comment it all away, and then we will do all this stuff afterwards. So this one goes, this one goes, this one goes, and this will fix later. Okay, so the raw data will be the first part of the log message, which is this part, or this part right here. And the log message will be anything past this particular marker. So for now, let's see if we can get this stuff split. Alright, since we know that we end up grabbing this part here, it might be beneficial for us to see if we can split on a closing bracket. By doing that, if we only have 2 entries, we will only get a string array with 2 entries in it. If we have 3 of them, by splitting on the close bracket, we will end up having 3 instances. We could split on the opening bracket, but then we would end up with 3 entries, because the first one would be empty for a 2-entry setup, and we would have 4 entries for the 3-entry setup, again because the first one would cause 1 empty string to be there. No point in doing that. Okay, let's split the raw data from the log into parts dividing at close bracket. Okay. Let's call this bracket parts and make this a string array, and we'll do raw data dot split and split at the closing bracket. This should then always throw us the exact amount that we need, which would then allow us to check whether we get 2 of them or 3 of them. So let's do that in a switch quick. Bracket parts dot length case 2. Vanilla log entry, and if it's 3, it's a forge mod loader log entry. Includes the mod ID. No mod ID here. And break this one. Okay, so we know that we still need the timestamp and such, so we may want to declare the timestamp stuff further up, so we can just reference it when we need it. So let's go grab that one quick, and we'll just do an empty string for now, like so. And then we can here do the timestamp equals bracket parts, the first entry, and then we need to replace the opening bracket with nothing, and then we'll do a trim to remove the let's see, that would be the leading space. And of course this is identical for the other setup. Actually, we may want to we probably don't need this, we can skip it, just to prevent any crashes. Hey SAS, um, we'll make sure that we actually got some parts to work with, greater than or equal to 2, and then do this instead. There we go. Now we've got the timestamp set up, and then we need the source info. So we should probably see if we can put that into a setup. So we'll do that here, source info, and then since the Forge mod loader puts the mod ID last, we know that the second entry at index 1 will still contain the thread and whichever log level was assigned to this particular log entry. So we can easily do the same for source info. Grab the second entry, replace the the open bracket with nothing, and finish off with a trim to remove any excess spaces. There we go. Alright, we also know that we're going to need a mod ID, so we'll put that in here, leave that empty, and then we'll do a check to see if we actually did get a 3 entry setup. If we did, then we'll do the same for mod ID, grabbing the third part, which is index 2, replace the open bracket with nothing, and then do a trim. Alright, see, this takes care of splitting up the bracket parts for us and stuffing them into our local work variables. So next up we can get rid of this, and then we can uncomment this. There we go. So if the source info has a slash in it, which it should, then we'll split it to get the source and the log level. And if it doesn't have a slash in it, then we will simply assume that it is a non-log level specified log entry and just assign the source information. Oh yes, I absolutely forgot all about that. Yes, I did find the issue. For some obscure reason, the server properties file had become corrupted at some point during the process, and that caused the settings to go out of sync, which resulted in the password for the remote console connection becoming incorrect. The result was that Archon tried to connect to the server and ended up getting an invalid login, which then forced Archon to disconnect, thus killing the thread. So I fixed up the server properties file. I believe I found a minor bug in the inifile class, and I also had a problem with the way that a server host detects whether it's online or not. I had to do a little workaround to make sure that the flag that reports whether it's running or not actually gets reset back to false once the thread is shut down. The problem here was that the variable that contains the thread itself was never disposed of, which meant that doing a quick check on it basically said, oh, this object is still alive, so we're still running. And that effectively prevented it from restarting as well. So all of it got fixed. I also pushed the source code to GitHub, so all of the updates are there. All right, so next up, we need to fix the timestamp. Absolutely good stuff. So I'll re-enable this. Whoops. There we go. This one, that one. They didn't need to be removed. This one we no longer need because we already got the timestamp from up here. We also don't need to trim it in any way, so we can simply get rid of this. And just to make sure, again, like safety in code, we will quickly grab these and put them here and then set them to 0. There we go. And then put a check. Timestamp has at least one occurrence of a colon. Then we'll do this. Move this and put this in here. And of course get rid of these. And finally, we need to update our log entry with the new mod ID. So we'll add that here. Now keep in mind that since we pre-initialize it to be empty, it will be an empty string if it is a vanilla server, because this will never execute, which means the mod ID will be empty. If it is a Forge-based server, it will split out the mod ID and of course update the variable. And if it's a non-valid log entry, then we'll simply just throw an empty one. There we go. All right, so this takes care of the slash problem that we had with the console parser. Of course, since we are messing about with the log entries, we should probably also update the console changed event to reflect the changes that we've made to the log entry. So we will go do that, and that should be up here somewhere. Events. Yay. Console changed. So here we will add in a mod ID, which of course is a string. Here we also need to add in excuse me, the mod ID, so we can pass it along. There we go. And then we need to update the event raise, which is right here. And we'll put in the entry.mod ID. There we go. That takes care of that. And then of course we also need to update the event in the main form. So we shall fix this by adding in the mod ID, and of course also pass it along here like so, and that takes care of this particular problem. Okay, so with this in hand, we are now also able to in some fashion detect whether this is actually a vanilla server or a Forge-based server, because if it's a Forge-based server, then at some point mod ID will contain some kind of text, as the example shows here, right here. There will be some kind of mod name here that could be applied energistics, for example. This particular entry won't happen, but just to showcase what it would look like. It could be thermodynamics or whichever mod is installed. The actual code name of the mod itself will show up here, which means the mod ID will also contain something. And in terms of decoding all this information, if we at some point decide to, say for example, add a separate window that shows the log entries, then we could build miscellaneous filter functions that allows us to, say for example, filter on a specific mod. We only want to see the console entries for this particular mod. We only want to see them at, say for example, warning level. Are there any entries, and then have the console log show only those filtered entries. To do that, we may want to expose all these individual parts as part of the log changed event. So the main program can grab those and store them for use. Kind of depends where we want to go with it. In any case, this should take care of those particular issues for the sake of testing, and that these modifications that we've made now are actually coming through. We'll do a quick debug dump, and we'll do log level and bracket like this, and we'll put a hashtag in there and add the server host ID. Of course, we need to convert that into a string, and then we'll put let's see. No, actually, we'll put that first. Get rid of this quick. There we go. Okay. Let's put the server host ID here, and then put the log level in here. Log level followed by the mod ID, like so, and then put the message in here. There we go. This should now take care of dumping whatever comes out of it. So let's give this a test run and see if we run into some kind of problem. Alright, let's see if we can fire up the vanilla one. There we go. Yes. Allow this. There we go. And we are getting all the stuff that we want. Info, the empty bracket right here would be the mod ID. I also figured out why this particular exception is thrown. This actually stems from the check to see whether the socket has been initialized and is active. However, in the code it's put inside a try catch. So in a sense it is handled, except I'm not grabbing the actual exception message. So that's why it shows up here. In terms of executing and running, makes no difference. Alright, so we can see that the vanilla one works perfectly. So let's see if we can start up the Forge-based one and possibly get some IDs from it. Start. Ooh, interesting. See, here we are actually getting some actual mod IDs. So let's have a look at those quick. I know it might be small, but let's see. It starts up with the launch wrapper. That's the core of the Forge mod loader. Then it switches to the actual mod loader itself, runs through those, boots up Minecraft Forge, and the microblocks and the multiparts. MC multipart is part of the Forge multipart setup. Loads up Railcraft, so we can in fact actually sort correctly on these. And as we can see, we are actually getting the correct log level. Warning, info. On some of the mods, they even throw debug stuff in there because they haven't removed it from their mods before they released them. Shame on you. But we can see that it's actually working the way it's supposed to, so let's get these two shut down. Stop this one and stop the other one. There we go. Cool. And that takes care of the first issue from last time. The second issue that we were facing last time is a little more involved, and it's actually listed right here. Assume that both lists are synchronized. That would be the server profile list and the server host list. To get these correctly synchronized, we kind of need to store the server host ID alongside with the server profile that goes with it. And just to make sure, I quickly want to check that this server properties didn't corrupt again. No, it didn't. So we're good. I have no idea why it ended up getting corrupted. It happened. I just don't have a source for it, so I can't explain it. In any case, to get all of this stuff properly synchronized, we at least need to update the server profile with an ID, and that ID should of course match the instance of server host that we are creating and launching. Now, by doing this, we can actually maintain the list of server hosts according to whether they are running or not, which means we can actually get rid of them when the server is shut down, at least to some extent. Of course, this all depends on how we end up doing the maintenance restarts, how we end up doing the backup stuff, but it's a possibility. So let's go have a look at server hosts quick, because right here it specifies that we have to boot it up with some kind of ID assigned to it. And as we can see, it's a standard integer, so we'll update the server profile with an integer called ID. And just for the sake of argument, we'll set that to -1, indicating it's not in use. There we go. Then at some point when we get to it, we kind of need to figure out how to synchronize these. But before I start doing that, I'm going to go through stuff here and see where we need to put that in. These need to be changed according to configuration instead of selection. These lists may at some point become desynced, which of course is the situation where a server is shut down and the profile is removed from the actual list itself, this list. In such a situation where one server is running and another server is not running and removed, then we quickly could end up desynchronizing these, because then one list would be longer than the other one, and thereby the index positions no longer work as IDs. So we might want to figure out a way to assign these IDs and then make sure that we also correctly assign them to the actual server hosts themselves. One of the thread problems we had involved the running flag, which is here somewhere. There we go. Originally, it simply returned a check to see whether the server thread was not equal to null. Since that didn't exactly reset the way it was supposed to or expected by the rushed code, then I actually had to build this entirely new way of detecting whether it's active or not. Whenever a thread shuts down, is alive goes false, and I'm using that to effectively kill off the object itself in the running flag check, because that's effectively the only place that I can do it past the end of life of the thread itself. So if at some point running is checked after the thread has shut down, that also takes care of cleaning up the variable itself. And that's one of the bug fixes. Okay, let's see. We have a lot of stuff here, so let's get rid of some of these quick and see if we can come up with some code that can handle this cross-list setup stuff for us. So we could assign randomized numbers, we could assign sequential numbers. It doesn't really matter what kind of identification we use, as long as we ensure that whatever ID number is assigned isn't already in use. So I would suggest that we simply use sequential ID numbers. That way we don't have to do any kind of jumping through hoops to figure out whether an ID is already in use or not. We will go, let's see, somewhere we have check server profiles. That was the one I needed. This one takes care of loading the icons and stuff. So we should probably also use this to assign a sequential number. So let's grab get mouse profile index, select server profile. Let's see if we can put a method in here that let's see, right here, for example, next server ID. Okay, so to do this, we will do a local variable. We just need a counter, so we'll do current server ID equals 0. So we'll start at, no, actually we'll do -1. Then we'll do a method called next server ID that simply increments this one and then returns it. There we go. Generates the next available server ID, returns an available server ID. All right. So this takes care of grabbing some IDs for us. We'll add a couple of more methods to go through the two lists so we can get the correct index for the correct entry in the correct list. And we'll see if we need to build methods that can synchronize those lists in both directions. We'll probably need to be able to do that since we've got, let's see, server host events. And these events all expose the assigned ID for this particular server host. So if we need to go check something on the server profile versus this particular server instance, then we need a way to correctly sync in that direction. When starting a server up by using the UI, we have the server profiles list as the primary, which means we need to synchronize from the server list to the server hosts list instead. So we'll most likely need both directions. Okay. Let's see, check server profiles. Since we are checking this frequently, this would probably be a good place to check whether an ID has been assigned, and if one hasn't been assigned, then we'll assign it right away. So before we do the check for the server icon, we'll simply just check it here. So if the config.profiles p.id equals -1, then we'll assign it. Profiles p.id equals next server ID. Because it is not a variable. Oh, right. Yeah, that's the downside of exposing a list directly. So we shall see if we can fix that. Let's see, we have some public methods right here. So let's go down here and do add, we'll do assign method, assign ID. Like so. This would then be the profile index, new ID. And to make sure that we are within the bounds of the list itself, let's see, what is the name of the variable? I can't remember. Oh, it's in here somewhere, right there. mbar profiles. There we go. So, if profile index greater than or equal to 0, and it is less than the count, then we shall grab that profile index, the ID, and assign it to this, and then update the changed flag. What? I hate lists. Arrays are so much easier to work with. And yes, I know that a lot of people prefer lists and collections over arrays any day, but yeah, it's all for the sake of convenience. All right, so we'll modify it some other way. We've got the server profile. Profile equals this one. Profile.id equals new ID. And then we'll just go the other way around to update it. There we go. Whoops. Assigns the past ID to the specified server profile. The index of the server profile to assign an ID to. The ID to assign to this server profile. There we go. All right. That takes care of that problem. So, the other problem we had was this particular issue, so we shall simply do config.assign ID. This would then be the p counter, and then assign that one. There we go. Assign a new ID to this server profile. There we go. All right. Next up, we need to see about where we are building the server host list, because it's in here somewhere. And we may have to add in some extra stuff to take care of synchronizing the ID of our individual server host stuff. Actually, let's see. This initialize thing loops through those, yes. And that would be right here. And since we are currently just assigning the counter, we shall get the ID from the profile instead. There we go. This now, at least to some extent, assigns the same ID to the server host as the configuration profile got. So far, so good. We still need some synchronization tools, so let's see about getting those. So for that purpose, we need a couple of methods to loop through the two lists that we have, one of them being the server profiles stored in the configuration, and the other one being the list of server hosts, so we can determine which one is which. And we basically just need to get the list index number of the particular entry that has a matching ID. For this one, we're using the mvar server hosts, and the other one is in the config object. So we shall get a couple of methods for that. This would be, let's see, get server host index. There we go. Of course, it needs to return an integer because we need an index number within the list. So we will expect to get a server host ID. Actually, we'll just do a server ID because this could be from either one of the two lists, but since we're assigning that ID to both of them, it's from one or the other. Alright, so this one will be returning a matching index for the server host. So that would be the server host list we need to look through. In case we don't find it, we'll return -1. And then we'll simply just loop through the server host list, mvar server host.count, and see if we can find a matching ID. If this one .id equals the server ID here, then we will simply return the counter from the loop, because that points to the actual index within the list. So that takes care of this. Attempts to find a matching server host instance within the server hosts list based on the past ID. The server ID to look for returns the list index if found, otherwise -1. There we go. We need a similar function for looping through and checking the server profiles within the configuration. So we will host profile will go down here and do get server profile index. And again, we need an index number, so we'll pretty much do the same thing, except this would then be the other list. So we'll quickly replicate that. Naming of these loop counters, completely optional. You can call it whatever you want to call it. You could even, just for the sake of SAS's enjoyment, you could call it Olsen Gamle Hest. It doesn't matter. As long as you know what it is. This would then be from the config profiles, and since this is also a list, we can reference that. Whoops. And if this particular profile, whoops, and not P but S, has an ID that matches this particular server ID, then again we return the counter, because that points to this particular entry in that list. Alright, so this takes care of granting us some tools to look up the list index based on whatever ID was assigned to it. So this is basically the same thing. Attempts to find a matching server profile within the config. Based on the past ID. And this one will just copy from up here, so I don't have to retype all of it. There we go, because it's the same thing. And this takes care of granting us the tools we need to keep these two lists correctly synchronized. Now we do have to keep in mind that these two methods may return -1 if one or the other of the two lists at some point loses an entry. These will definitely go out of sync. One ID will exist in one of them where the ID doesn't exist in the other one. So when we use these tools, we definitely need to check whether we got a response of -1, indicating that none was found. Okay, so where exactly do we need to synchronize these? Well, right here is a perfect example. Um, since it states right here, this is assuming both lists are synchronized. This would be the perfect spot to implement this stuff. And since this one indicates which of the server profiles is currently selected on the UI, we can fetch the ID directly from the server profile list and then check it up against this particular host ID that came with the event triggering. So this code is kind of unstable, so we kind of need to get rid of that. But before we do that, just for comparison purposes, we will now check whether the currently selected profile, which of course is the, um, the list in the configuration at the current selection index, if the ID here equals the ID that we got from the event, then we'll do the disable of the start button. Now that we have these options, we can more easily and more quickly cross-check and be sure that we get the correct references because we're using the ID to synchronize across both of them. We can get rid of this. Past this point. There we go. And let's see if there are other instances. Oh yeah, right here. And this is effectively exactly the same thing. If config profiles profile selection index.id equals the ID we got from the event, then we can enable the stop button. And not much of a difference, but this difference still has enormous power compared to the previous setup. This particular setup is somewhat fragile. In the event that we choose to remove a profile while a couple of other servers are running, this particular piece of code would end up crashing because they wouldn't match, or they would start exhibiting weird behavior. For example, showing the stop button enabled for a server that is currently shut down. Weird things can happen. There we go. Let's see if there are any others. Oh, another one down here. So we'll fix that. And since we've seen it a couple of times now, we'll just do it here. Profiles. Add in the ID right there. And this takes care of it. And let's see if we have another one right here. Profiles. ID. And that's pretty much it. We still have one particularly nasty issue with running with these cross-synchronized lists, and the issue that we are having is this particular setup. This particular setup can also cause a somewhat annoying problem because we can end up assigning the same remote console port to two different servers. And since in a socket TCP environment you can't have effectively two different programs listening on the same port, because whichever program starts first um, ends up owning the rights to that port. We kind of need to figure out a better way of doing this. We need to do some kind of assignment that ensures that we won't end up having the remote console port number assigned twice for the same port number. Now, one way we can do that is by effectively going through the server properties and then, for example, add 100 or subtract 100 to whichever port number that particular server got assigned. As an example, for the vanilla server, we assigned the default server port for it, 25565, and for the modded server, I assigned, let's see if we can find it, the port right after it. So they already have differing port numbers, and we could then simply just decide that for Archon, we will simply add 100 to whatever port this particular server was assigned to. These are options and settings that our users will be able to manipulate. So before attempting to start up a server, we may want to go through the list and check whether that port is already in use, and then tell the user there is a port conflict between these two servers. You need to fix it on this one, and then maybe pop the configuration dialog. That's also something that I've got on my to-do list for today. At some point we will get back to this. I'll put in a note right here. The assignment of Archon port must be changed to avoid port conflicts. Note to self: it doesn't do anything unless you get a specific Visual Studio extension that takes care of this particular setup. Okay, so we know that we can add servers. We also know that we can edit them. But one thing that we still can't do is we still can't access this one. Now, this is the actual server configuration stuff that we built a couple of episodes back, which would allow us a nice graphical interface to basically manipulate all of these annoying settings. So it would be kind of nice, excuse me, it would be kind of nice if we could add in some way of getting to this dialog for a specific server profile. So let's have a quick look at the other one. This one only allows us to specify a custom name for the server, the path and the jar to where the server is, and how much memory we want to give it. But at the moment, that's all the configuration we can do. I think it would be nice if we were able to drop into this dialog so we can change all these settings as we see fit. However, any changes to the server properties file must be made while the server is shut down. If you make any changes to any of these settings while the server is running, all of those changes are ignored, and most likely the scenario will end with the server properties file being rewritten when the server shuts down, which means any changes made will be discarded. So This is something that we need to do a check on to figure out whether this particular configuration dialog should be available depending on whether the server is running or not. Now, luckily, we have a few options available to us. Some of the options that we have available is that we can go and do a check on the actual server host itself to figure out whether it is currently running or not. Now, these buttons that we have here, the start button and the stop button, these are actually these refer to the previous setup where we assumed that those lists would be synchronized at all times. So we will have to do the checks here to see if we can actually find this particular server host according to the ID of the currently selected profile. We can't assume that these are that these will always be in sync. So we need to make changes to these as well. When it comes to the edit dialog, again we need to cross-check, and if the running flag, this one, on the selected server host is true, then we should probably throw a message to the user stating that you need to shut down this server before you can make any changes to the configuration. So that's something we will be doing here as well. This entire setup needs to be changed, but before we forget, we'll go and fix the start and stop buttons quick. We have already implemented that. Okay, so first of all, profile selection index, that's part of our custom UI. You use DB. Could you elaborate, please? Do you mean database? No, not at the moment. Honestly, I don't see any point in implementing any kind of database interfacing for this, since all of this stuff is basically just a kind of a launch wrapper, and the servers that will be running this stuff will always be on the same machine as the program is running. And I don't really want any kind of outside access to this. Typically, any kind of outside access to it poses a risk of being hacked or DDoSed. So I didn't really see any point in implementing a lot of database stuff for it. In my opinion, you should only implement database interfaces if you really need it. For vast setups like, for example, let's say an actual server host that hosts Minecraft servers for customers, in such a situation it might be beneficial to implement a database setup so you can centralize information for each individual server, Minecraft server instance that's running, and then update all of the information across the database so you can centralize it across multiple physical servers. But for this particular setup, it's not really needed. The IDs that I'm talking about are just sequentially generated numbers, and they only exist for the sole purpose of us being able to synchronize across two different lists. One of them being the core configuration for launching an actual Minecraft server, meaning which drive and what folder is it in, what's the name of the jar, and how much memory should we assign to Java when running this particular setup. That would be the server profile. The server host class that we've got sitting right here is an actual wrapper around the instance of Java. It takes care of catching console output from Java and passing it along through events so we can properly monitor, say, the startup or the shutdown of any given server setup. So that's the only thing we need those IDs for, and since we don't exactly need that information to be statically stored, definitely no point in spending a lot of time in implementing database stuff for it. It is basically just a session ID, nothing more. In any case, we definitely need to add in some stuff here to properly synchronize it. So we'll do a quick local variable and see if we can get the server host index based on the currently selected profile selection index. There we go. And if this is greater than -1, then we've got the right one, and then we just need to change this to index instead, and we're off. Nothing particularly difficult, since the get server host index does all the work for us. We just need to specify the ID of it to keep them synchronized. And of course we also need to do the same thing here, except since this one is also doing a check to see whether this particular server host is running, we kind of need to break this further down because we first need to get the proper index for it, and then we can do the check. This would be for stopping a server that is currently running. We do have events that tell us when a server is starting up and when the server has finished stabilizing the worlds, which leaves us a little bit of time during the startup process where the server is starting up, but it has not finished its startup process. So we kind of need to make sure that things are synchronized in the right way. This would basically be the same thing to begin with. So let's get the index, get server host index. Again, we need to check up against the profile selection index and the ID of it. And then we can do the check to see if this particular index is greater than -1, meaning we actually did get a list index. And then we can move this down here instead, and of course reference the correct index. And if we have the actual index of the server host list and it is running, then we can stop it and disable the stop button, and of course use the correct list index. There we go. That takes care of ensuring that our lists are always synchronized by means of the assigned session IDs for each individual instance. Okay. Last but not least, the edit button. At the moment it just looks like this, and these are all hidden um, because we are doing some custom UI stuff for it. This is what it looks like when it's actually running. And at the moment, these were the two buttons we were messing with. We are currently about to change the edit button. At the moment, it just pops this dialog. But we need to put in a check to see whether it is actually running or not. And if this particular server is running, then we'll simply just pop a message saying you need to shut it down before you can edit the configuration for it. We also have this one. And this dialog will allow us to manipulate all of the settings in the server properties file that is used by the Minecraft server itself to change conditions for gameplay and world generation and stuff. So we're doing the preparation work for implementing these correctly, so we can get them properly working. Hi there, Spy. Welcome to the stream. Okay, so from our custom UI stuff, which is drawn using GDI+, we end up getting a profile selection index. That index is based on which of these two is clicked when it turns blue. Profile selection index goes positive. If we click outside, we deselect, and then it goes back to -1. So just like any other typical list. Google is your friend, and YouTube is also your friend for that, definitely. There are tons and tons and tons of tutorials on YouTube, and I'm pretty sure that you can find some decent ones by Googling a bit. Of course, you can also stay here, listen in, and see how I'm implementing different parts of this particular project. Most of what I'm doing here is basic C#. There are not all that many things that are overly complicated. Most of them deal with some kind of data check. As you can see here, standard if statement to figure out whether this particular variable contains a specific value. Most of that stuff is stuff that you will need to do ASP.NET development in C#. So, well, good luck with your code. Okay, so just like we did in the start button and the stop button, we need to do the ID synchronization checks. So we'll do the checks again. Get server host index, because we do need to absolutely, hey Joban, we still need to synchronize these. So profile selection index ID, and then we need to check that this is greater than -1. All of this stuff we need to move further on at some point. We'll get there. First of all, we need to figure out whether this particular server instance is running. So let's do that quick. Now, we already had that check down here by means of referencing the server hosts list and then checking the running flag to see whether it's alive or not. So we'll do the same. And if it's running, then tell the user to shut this thing down first. And if it's not running, then we can pop the configuration dialog for it. So we'll move that up here, and there we go. All right, so here we kind of need to throw the user a message box, so we'll do that. And since we already have all of the indexes that we need, we can actually customize this particular message box. So let's do that. We'll put in a plus the config profiles, profile selection index, and then do the name. And then is currently running. Please shut down the server before changing the configuration. There we go. Okay. Server may not. Nah. Shut down server. There we go. And then we'll need to put a button in there. We'll do an OK only, and then we'll need to put some kind of icon on there, so we'll do the exclamation, and we should be good. Alright. We are properly synchronizing with the ID, the session ID of the server. We're checking that we actually found it. We're checking to see whether it's running. If it is running, we'll throw the user a message stating that it's running. We need to shut it down before we can change the config. If it's not running, then we will simply pop the configuration dialog for it. Now, the server profile config dialog would be this one. That's the one where we can specify the custom name for it, where we can specify where the server lives and which jar to use when starting up the server. On this one, we also need to add another button which will pop this one, so we can change the server properties for it. We should probably also implement something to check whether the server properties file exists. If it doesn't, then we'll pre-create it, and we'll also take care of dumping in the standard EULA text file that needs to be in there. Basically, that's the only thing the server is looking for. So whether we put this in or not doesn't really matter all that much. We just need to dump this in. So, yeah, just a little bit of custom coloring. So far, so good. We'll get to this in a bit. First of all, I think we should do another test run to make sure that the code we just implemented works correctly. So let's give it a try, see what happens. Let's fire up the vanilla server. Start button is enabled, goes disabled, and it should start up in a bit. There we have it. It's running nicely, and we'll see if we can edit. Vanilla 1.12.2 is currently running. Please shut down the server before changing the configuration. Okay. So let's shut it down and see if we can edit it now. There we have it. That's pretty neat. Cool. All right. So let's have a quick look at this one. Now this one is just the very rudimentary setup. I actually have something planned for it. I would prefer to avoid having too many animating things on the form itself. A, because it requires a full form update, or the creation of a custom user control that can do the spinning. Alternatively, we can do it with simple status icons and just change those according to what the server is currently doing. And for that purpose, just to reduce the well, we can do a busy cursor, but since we're allowing multiple instances of servers running, we kind of still need to be able to manipulate other server profiles while one of them is starting up or shutting down, for example. So what I've done instead is I've actually prepared some status icons that we are going to implement. And these will be sitting alongside with the profiles. Let's fire this up quick. Go here and here. So as you can see, there is a certain size that we've set aside for showing each profile. And one of the things that I want to do is I want to add in information from the server properties file that indicates the maximum amount of players that can be on the server. When it is shut down, it will of course show 0 players out of say 20. But when it's running, we'll have the launcher application update the current player count on the UI as well. So what I've done is I've grabbed some of my some icons from one of my icon collections. When it is shut down, I'll put the red stop button here. When it is starting up, I'll replace it with the blue up arrow. When it's running, I'll replace that with the green play icon so we can see there quickly this thing is actually running. And again, when it's shutting down, we'll use the blue down arrow and then switch back to the red stop button or stop icon. So we'll put those on to indicate the current state of the server itself. And that of course means we'll make use of the different events that we trigger as the server is starting up, has finished starting up, and starting its shutdown process, and finally stopped completely. We're getting there. I also somewhere, I can't remember where I put them. UI parts maybe? No. Oh, somewhere I made some cutouts from the game clients in the multiplayer screen. That's all too much logic with its say 5-minute limit. Yeah. Thank you very much for the follow. Daddle. I'm not sure if I pronounced your name right. In any case, we were doing some stuff. Yes, we were going to add in another button in here. That's what we wanted to do. So select, and we should we'll call this properties, and then we'll put it here. Meetings. Yeah, that should suffice. I'll do. Whoops. I have done very little in terms of Java development, primarily because I think it's a crappy language that should have died back in the 90s. But that is an entirely different debate, and I know that people generally tend to religiously defend Java. It's good for some things, but for game programming, in my opinion, it's about the worst choice you could ever do, simply because it is heavily bloaty, as is evident by the sheer amount of memory and CPU usage Minecraft in itself has. The one thing that is positive about doing game development in Java is that it is extremely easy to modify the game itself. which is also why we have so many mods for it. So there are ups and downs for everything, but overall, I'm running a custom designed mod pack, one that I created for a closed community of friends, and we have about 140 mods in there. And on a good day, it easily eats up 4 gigabytes of memory just running the game with those mods installed. If Minecraft and the mods had been written in, say, C Sharp, the memory spendage would be for all 140 mods, including the vanilla core, would most likely never exceed 800 megabytes of memory spent. And regardless how you choose to look at things, it always takes longer to handle 4 gigabytes of memory than it does handling 800 megabytes. So it's a performance thing, definitely. I have done some vanilla plugin development in the past. Um, Different kinds of system tools for server administrators and server moderators and stuff. Things like custom mod request systems for players in a community. I've done a bunch of different log search tools. I've done some ban handling tools of different kinds. Tons of different things. I've also been part of developing a grief protection system that basically made Townie look like something from the Stone Age, both in terms of ease of use and in terms of features. So I have done some Java development, yes, but it's not something that I tend to do a lot of. Basically because of A, performance reasons, B, it's bloaty as heck. Pardon the language. Anyway, oh yes. Properties. So let's do the properties button. There we go. Now the properties button will then pop, let's see, this one. And we'll make that modal as well. So we can't step back in the currently open windows and basically cross-contaminate the way things need to be handled. But before we fully implement this, we kind of need to have a look at a couple of other things. Now, one of the things that we should probably check is to see whether, let's see, we'll grab this one. We need to check whether server properties exists within the server folder, and we can also pre-generate the EULA.txt file if it doesn't exist in the folder. By doing that, we don't have to go through the okay, start this up to have the files generated, then shut it down again, change the settings, and then start it up again. With this, the goal is to allow us full access to all these things by means of a nice graphical interface. And yes, it's debatable whether it looks nice or not. Personal taste, I guess. Actually, we should probably not grab this one. Put a label on there. If I could find it. And we shall do the back for color. There we go. I think we use this one. and then do server config. There we go. All right. So um, we need this event, and we also need to move this up to the other buttons, which we have here somewhere. That's the cancel. That would be the accept, and that would be the select button. So we'll put it in here. There we go. Okay. So let's see. Part of the accept button should probably involve figuring out whether we need to generate some of these files. So to do implement a check to see if euler.txt and server properties exist. If either file doesn't exist, create it with default values. Now, one thing that we will not create with the default value is the euler.txt. If the file isn't there, we will simply generate it with a true value right off the bat. This one will always be generated having the flag set false, since we don't really want to force the user through either creating the file or opening it up and setting the flag to true. We will simply do it for the user if it's not there. If it's there, we could potentially load it up, see if the flag has been set true. If not, we'll change the flag and write the changes again. So that's one thing where we won't exactly be using default values. For the server properties, if it doesn't exist, we will simply just use the default values, and most of the default values are already written in here, more or less pre-selected. But we probably want to see about being able to generate a default setup for server properties. So that's something we will be adding to this dialog somewhere. The reason for adding it in here is that we don't know if the user will actually click the properties button and do any kind of changes to this setup before the accept button is clicked. Yeah, maybe. In any case, we definitely need to put those up at some point in here. The reason for putting it here is because this is where we specify where the server resides. So this would be the perfect place to put these default setups. That way, whoever is using this program can create a new folder, download the server jar, stuff the server jar in that folder, fire up the server launcher, create a new server profile pointing to the jar, and it'll, boom, run. There we go. Are you serious? Holy smokes. Talk about bloatware. My, oh my, oh my. Whew. Don't give me a heart attack, man. Okay. Let's start by implementing some of these default file things that we need to implement. So we'll do an internal helper methods. No, people generally don't care about how bloaty stuff is because compared to the pricing of memory 10 years ago, buying 16 or 32 gigs or 64 gigs today is as cheap as buying a pack of crisps. So it doesn't really matter to most people. The only situation where it starts to matter for them is in how fast their bus is on the motherboard and how fast the CPU can process memory data going in and out. That's where the real bottleneck is. And at some point, all of these bloaty environments are going to come back and haunt people in terms of how laggy it becomes. Perfect example is Java. And everybody complains about how laggy Minecraft always is. And yes, it is, because it is extremely resource intensive. The more resources you spend, both on the CPU and memory and disk, the slower stuff will run. So if you can get away with it, choose something that is way less bloaty and do your development there. But regardless what kind of development you choose to do, there is no best language. And the age-long, I've been going through this religious debate for 30 years, at least. The age-old religious fight over which programming language is best is a fight that really shouldn't exist because there is no best language for all tasks. There is only a preferred language for a specific task. And the best developers out there are multilingual. So choose whichever language fits the job description best, and then go with that. If it's C# for this development, then go with C#. If it's something that requires high performance, above and beyond requirements, then go with C or C++, because you do gain performance there. So evaluate the task at hand and choose the language that fits the bill. Oh yeah, you do remember the 64K data limit, right? Oh man, I remember those days. 64 kilobytes of data segment and 64 kilobytes of code segment. That was it. 128 kilobytes of memory assigned for a single program. I would love to see some of the younger developers get by on that these days. Oh, those were the days. Okay, so where were we? Ah, right. I wanted to do the EULA stuff. So private void check EULA file. We definitely need to check that, and we also need something to check the server properties file at some point, and we probably need some kind of default generation for it. Now we could make use of, and this is again one of those situations where it's a matter of how many resources we are spending. We have this brilliant inifile class that is perfectly capable of that's perfectly capable of handling this. It would also be perfectly capable of handling the EULA file itself. But the way I see it, if I go and instantiate a new object just to do a single line of text that has true or false in it, then I'm effectively spending a lot more memory and a lot more CPU cost than I actually have to just to generate that one file. So here I will simply do a Oh, actually, that needs to go down here somewhere. Right. Generate EULA file. Now, like I said, the Minecraft server doesn't care about whether these comments are there or not. The only thing it ever cares for is this small piece of text. Oh yeah, I keep seeing the same thing. So the only thing that we actually need to generate is EULA equals true. All the comment stuff we don't need to generate, and yes, some would say that this is circumventing Mojang's requirement of us accepting the EULA. However, I have run multiple different Minecraft communities, successful ones, and the one thing that I hate above everything else is having to go through setting this one file to true for every new server instance I build. And I have built in the thousands of individual Minecraft server instances over the years. So that's a lot of EULA files being generated and changed. And any server operator slash administrator knows that this is tedious because we already read that EULA a long time ago. Every now and then most server owners check up on it to see if they've made any changes. So for us, this is just a pestilence that we really don't need. So Mojang, sue me. We are just going to generate it straight up as is. Alright, so to generate it, we need to know where to put it. And that's something that we are getting as part of the server profile. We know that this text box, which would be that one, will contain a path. So we will simply just throw that path up in our generator. So we'll do path equals server path text trim. I do believe that we forced it to have a trailing backslash. Yes, we did. So we can safely assume that we can do the as EULA txt. There we go. And we could, if we wanted to, do something like this, and then do EULA generated by Minecraft server launcher, then line break. Oh, I'm sure she's having a lot of fun. And then we will just do the EULA equals true. And because I'm having typing issues today, I think I'm just gonna copy paste this. End of story. This is all we need. And for the sake of not running into a lot of file I/O issues, we'll check to see if the EULA file exists. If it does, we'll try and see if we can get rid of it. Since we're getting to this point of generating the EULA file, this particular instance will most likely never happen. Unless the user decides to manually start the server instance while this particular dialog is open. So just in case that happens, we'll get rid of it and then make sure it's not there. And then we will simply just write all lines to the and stuff the, I believe we can put a string in there. EULA thing in there. There we go. write all text, and then do this. Alright. So this method now very quickly and easily, without instantiating a new object, generates a new EULA file for us and saves it in the server folder. Up here, we could rename this to EULA file exists, and then simply return a bool, and we'll grab a copy of this, and then we will simply just return file exists, that file path name. There we go. Because this one returns a boolean, so we'll get a true or false out of it. Now with this in hand, we'll move this up quick. As part of the accept button, which is down here, we're setting up the profile, storing all the settings to do implement a check to see if EULA-TXT and server properties exist. If not, EULA file exists, then generate EULA file. There we go. This now ensures that whenever a new server profile is created here, it'll check to see if the EULA file exists. If it doesn't, it'll generate it and preset it to true, meaning that the end user license agreement has been accepted. That way we don't have to worry about that anymore. Nice. Next bit would be doing all the server properties checks, generate some default settings for it, and for that for that purpose, we could just generate an empty one and embed it in our program here, and then just write that. Or we could preset it with whatever settings we want. It doesn't really matter which way we choose to do it, as long as we end up getting a server properties file generated if it doesn't exist. But at least now we have the EULA in place, so here we will go take a look at this dialog. Now for this one, I wanted to embed all of the server properties handling within this dialog, so we don't have to manage any of that outside of the dialog. So the only thing that we actually need to do is just pop the dialog and wait for it to finish. And that's basically it. The accept button on this dialog will then apply all of these settings to the server properties file and generate it. And this should also make it a little easier for us to at least figure out how we want to default all of these different settings. No, I don't. Windows Presentation Foundation. Well, the way I see it, after having looked into it, if I ever need something like a PowerPoint presentation style UI, I might choose to use Windows Presentation Foundation. Overall, I'm having a hard time figuring out exactly why Microsoft decided to merge PowerPoint with Visual Studio and WinForms. But I do get that hardware accelerated UI stuff is becoming more and more popular, primarily because Microsoft's standard UI rendering is becoming more and more bloaty and more sluggish. Hence why we have such a flat and boring UI on the newer versions of Windows. It's all a matter of them attempting to increase the performance of the standard WinForms UI, which has been heavily requested over the years. But if I ever were to create something that really needed a way better presentation elements for some kind of interface, then I might choose to use it. So far, I've only played around with it a bit to see what it was capable of, and then basically put it back in the box where it came from. Most of the stuff that I need to do on some kind of UI is stuff that I can do with either WinForms or even GDI Plus like I've done here. I mean, we've all seen how fast this reacts, and if you take a look at the CPU profiling here, the spikes are not particularly big, and this is re-rendering the entire surface of the window itself. It's still fast enough. So, in my opinion, stick with WinForms if you can get away with it. Visual Studio does allow you to do regular WinForms stuff, which you should also be able to do on Windows 10. You may have to hack Visual Studio to get it to accept it and not use the Windows Presentation Foundation, but I know it's possible. A fellow developer in Australia that I know runs regular WinForms and GDI Plus on his development, and he's on Windows 10. Well, then that's another incentive for me to stay on my beloved Windows 7 Ultimate. All right, let's see. We've got a break coming up. We want to pop this quick. So to do this, we kind of need to create the dialog. So let's do that, which would be the server config dialog. And since we want the dialog to handle all of it for us, we'll simply just show it. There we go. And then, of course, dispose of it afterwards. Boom. This should now allow us to access this dialog. Nice. This one doesn't exactly have all that much stuff assigned to it just yet because we kind of stopped halfway through it. So this would be the perfect opportunity to get all of this wired up correctly and even have it look for the server properties file in the folder where the server supposedly resides. Now to do that, we actually do have to expose a path. We may have to do some kind of method for that, which we in fact I already have. So we need to remember to put this up in the profile button. So we should do that here. And actually, before we do that, we may want to check that the path and the jar both have something in them. What I failed to mention today is that the text box for server path and the text box for the server jar are both set to read only, as you can see here. Okay. Oh, I feel it's violating the Raspberry throwing Windows on it, to be honest, but that's just my opinion. Put a Linux on there instead. um, oh yeah. I wouldn't mind having one of those just to play around with it. Um, okay, so we'll check those to see if we can actually pop the config dialog. If no jar and path have been specified, then there's no point in showing the dialog because we have no place to put the server properties file. So we'll do a quick check on these. Server path, text, whoops, length greater than divide by 0 exception, absolutely. Whoops. And the jar, if both of those are greater than 0, then we know that we actually have a valid path. So we will set Minecraft server path and simply just specify the server path text. There we go. Now this one custom method pre-initializes the server configuration dialog with the chosen path for the server profile. This can even be done without any of these configuration files being created. So we'll have them do all of that creation stuff for us. This one checks to see if we have a valid path, and then it checks to see if there is a properties file. If there isn't, then we'll need to generate some defaults. So we can have this one do that for us. But I am a heavy coffee drinker, and I think this would be the perfect time to take a couple of minutes break so I can respond to a much needed nature call. So we will dig into the server properties, server configuration dialog right after the break, and I'll be back in a couple of minutes.